It's my very great pleasure to be speaking at the Ted Rogers Heart Failure Symposium, and I'm delighted to be speaking about the latest on wearable technology and heart failure. In terms of my disclosures, I am supported by a grant from Transform HF. I've also received educational support from Boston Scientific, Biotronic, and Medtronic in the past, and I received research support and consultant fees from Boston Scientific over 2 years ago. So the outline of my talk goes over what wearable technologies are, what they can monitor, how they're useful in heart failure, and how we can best use them, and what the barriers are to their implementation in routine care. So what is wearable technology? Well, essentially, it's a non-invasive physiological sensor that's worn on the skin or on the body. It stores data which can be transmitted to the clinical team, who can access this data either in real time or in periodic intervals to guide data management of the patient. This includes patches, watches, wristbands, smart clothing, accessories, and external monitoring devices. But what do they actually monitor? There's a recent review which sums it up really quite well. There's a variety of different monitors, and each of them have their own parameters that they measure. The commonest one to measure is activity. So a triaxial accelerometer movements in three different directions are noted, particularly acceleration. This is used for measuring step count, activity, how long the activity goes on for, and the intensity of it. We see this with the Apple Watch Series 3 and above, the Fitbit Charge and Sense devices, the Huawei Watch. Some of the more complicated devices also have a gyroscope, which can measure angular motion, including GPS and a barometer. So you get changes in altitude, distance, stair count. Some of the smart rings have this information measured within them. Beyond that, there's photoplethysmography, and that uses a small light-emitting diode or an LED to measure microvascular blood volume changes, similar to how a pulse oximeter might work. This can capture a pulse rate and measure rhythm of the heart too. You can also get single lead ECGs by connecting the contralateral hand to a watch or by patch electrodes. Finally, and I'll go into more detail this later, we can also measure heart failure decompensation. So how are we using this in the management of heart failure? Well, as we already know, heart failure is a relapsing, remitting condition. We see patients on fixed intervals, and we get a spotlight into their condition at 3-month, 6-month intervals. During the time in between these clinic visits, patients can have improvements, deteriorations, which we often don't know about. And hopefully wearables and monitoring in general can help fulfill this gap. So the first area to talk about is probably when patients are rather stable. We can focus on their activity and seeing if we can improve the health of our population. So wearables are extremely good at measuring activity levels. It can be used as a surrogate for NYHA class. It's also a continuous measure of patient wellness and disease severity. If smart wearables are tracking patients' activity levels, and they can also promote weight loss and overall fitness improvement, we can see the effects of our population improving their health in general. One of the studies that looked at this was the BeFit study, which incorporated wearables with gamification. So there was a non-competitive, team-based intervention where patients were presented with a coffee mug as a prize over a 12-week intervention to improve their exercise rates. The intervention group reached a higher step count compared with the control group, but the effects tapered during the post-intervention period. So it means that whatever we're doing, we need to try and make it sustainable to ensure patient partnership in the interventions continues to work. At our own institution, the Peter Monk Cardiac Center, we are looking at what data collected from the Apple Watch can correlate with other measures of heart failure deterioration. The Ted Rogers Understanding Exacerbations of Heart Failure, TRUE-HF study, is currently recruiting patients and looking at them over 3 months to see what information we can gather and whether that correlates with the traditional measures such as 6-minute walk tests and exercise testing that we undertake on patients, to see if we can gather this information in real time and not at the episodic interactions we have. Another focus of wearables in heart failure management is after hospitalization. We see that hospitalization can cause a reduction in body mass, in lean body mass, muscle activity, and patients often leave hospital more frail than when they first came in. cardiac rehabilitation is a key part of heart failure management. And we saw during the pandemic that rehabilitation was largely switched to online and distance provision. Over 50% of rehab programs in Canada provided no services at all. And there was a move to using wearables to track patients' activity and their fitness levels. Many studies are ongoing looking at the effect of this, but by prescribing individual exercise prescriptions to patients, we can help facilitate improvement in clinical outcomes. And this is something to watch out for in the near future. The final area that I'll focus on is in the area of predicting deterioration. This is essentially the holy grail in identifying patients deteriorating before they require hospitalization to try and redress the physiological balance. We've been doing this for a number of years, and prediction of deterioration is not easy. We've tried telephoning patients to provide them support and advice and adherence to lifestyle measures after hospitalization. We ask patients to self-manage using scales, blood pressure cuffs to try and monitor any signs of congestion. And while there's been some success, it's not been widespread. Newer systems involve asking patients to take questionnaires on symptom burden, coupling this with physiological measurements through non-invasive technologies. And finally, in the last 10 years or so, we've seen a plethora of invasive monitoring techniques from patients who've had devices implanted for therapeutic purposes, whether that's through ICDs or CRTs. Unfortunately, remote monitoring doesn't always help. This is an example from the .HF study, which utilized a facility to measure intrathoracic impedance in 335 patients who had an implantable cardiac defibrillator. A decrease in impedance was felt to be a very sensitive measure of fluid accumulation within the lungs and pending decompensation, but actually it wasn't very sensitive. The study demonstrated that in patients whom the alert was activated, had a staggering 79% increase in hospitalization with no effect on mortality. This increased the work of the hospitals, this increased the burden upon the patients, and it also showed that while it was very sensitive, it wasn't a very specific measure for heart failure deterioration. It turned out only 1 in 5 of these alerts was accurate in the prediction of decompensation. More recent technologies have tried to piece together multiple different physiological measures. So again, this is an implantable technology, but it's very useful as a concept for when we move on to wearables. By using physiological data, incorporating heart sounds, thoracic impedance, respiratory rate, and nighttime heart rate, alongside patient activity levels from the built-in accelerometers, a picture of stability was derived in these patients who had a Boston Scientific device. Subsequent changes were then noted and then brought together in a heart failure index or a HeartLogic heart failure index. This was trained on 500 patients and then tested on 400 patients afterwards as part of the multi-sense study. In 320 patient years of follow-up, there was a 70% sensitivity in predicting a heart failure event, with the alert occurring 34 days before a heart failure decompensation event. And this was defined as either a hospitalization or a clinic visit where heart failure treatments were augmented or intravenous medication was required. And this has developed the idea of patients being their own control, as it were, detecting changes in multiple parameters and incorporating machine learning for the first time along the way. Moving on to wearables, the LINK-HF study was reported last year, which was a proof of concept, non-invasive patch monitor for heart failure deterioration. This sensor, which you can see in the bottom right-hand side, included a disposable patch with a disposable battery, which lasted for 7 days. And there was a reusable sensor electronics module, which was activated when the battery was inserted into the patch. The sensor has 2 electrodes, which face the skin, and were used for ECG detection, skin impedance measurement, and also incorporated a temperature sensor. A 3-axis accelerometer was also included, which measured a continuous ECG waveform, movement in 3 dimensions, skin impedance, temperature, and information on activity and posture. Now, all of the data that could be calculated from that are innumerable, but in particular, they focus on heart rate variability, arrhythmia burden, respiratory rate, and activity, both walking, sleeping, body tilt, and body posture. Study subjects were monitored for up to 3 months using the disposable sensor patch, and the data was uploaded continuously via a smartphone to an analytics platform that clinicians could then access. In the 100 subjects who were enrolled, they found that when patients were hospitalized or when they were in the clinic, they had significant changes from when they were at rest or when they were at expected levels of physiologic activity. The platform was able to detect precursors of hospitalization with a 76% sensitivity and an 85% specificity. And the median time between alert and admission was around 6.5 days. So this is very encouraging. This has shown that there is a link between both the data that we're collecting and clinical events that are happening to patients. Other collaborators have taken this a step further. So measuring seismography and the movement of the heart within the chest is a novel way of measuring in 3 dimensions how the heart's moving and what's happening with patients' breathing. Incorporates a variable ECG and seismocardiogram patch, you can see that on the bottom right-hand side, which is around 7 centimeters in size. And patients were recorded at rest and then asked to perform a 6-minute walk test and then rested again to provide baseline information on the patients. And these wearable technologies, recording cardiac function, incorporating machine learning, assessed both the compensated patients and when patients were admitted to hospital, what the changes occurred in these patients. So this is again very useful. The technology continues. There's examples of wearable vests, there are smart socks, and there's even a cardio skin, as you can see on the right-hand side, which have all been developed to try and show deteriorations. So with all this technology coming, what are the barriers to implementation? Well, first of all, for far too long, we've been developing novel sensors and not really integrating them into our clinical approach to patients. This is an old diagram from 2019, which shows all of the considerations that needed beyond just the technology. Teaching patients to be trained in the technology, getting their consent for data transfer, and then once the data arrives, making meaningful decisions, how that's delegated from the most responsible physician, how that involves community partners, heart failure nursing colleagues, and the patient themselves to try and make a change before the deterioration occurs. The problem with wearables, or an additional challenge, is that they're completely outside the control of the clinician. Patients may not use equipment how it's designed, and in the Link-HF study that I showed you, 10% of patients never wore the smart sticker as they were meant to. In the Apple Watch studies, we've seen that large numbers of patients drop out because they stop wearing the device. If you're not wearing the device and we're not collecting the data, we can't make any improvement. So technology has to incorporate patient partnership with usability testing. Otherwise, patients will vote with their feet or their wrists or their chest. And personally, looking at some of the technologies, I'm not convinced that patients would necessarily want to use them. With digital health technology in general, we need to move beyond the traditional methods of innovation integration. So therefore, we need to move forward with implementing digital health innovations, particularly with wearables. We're being bombarded with lots of data. For this to succeed in improving patient care, it needs to be organized properly for clinicians to make decisions. Patients need to be satisfied that their data is secure and will not be sold to insurance companies or marketing organizations. We need to develop digital biomarkers that can help predict change from baseline for individual patients. And we've probably made greater steps there, but machine learning, artificial intelligence will be key in deriving these useful signals. Finally, whatever we develop, we need to make sure it's validated in the patients we're treating. Moreover, we need to have systems that can react to signals being received so we can move to delivering care as needed by patients rather than on arbitrary historical schedules of seeing patients at fixed intervals. This would free up patients from accessing healthcare when they're clinically stable and don't really need it, preventing the inconvenience of coming to the hospital or seeking healthcare. But when patients do, clinical interactions and in-person interactions will be more fruitful and worthwhile, so we can try and improve patients as they're decompensating. At this point, I'll stop there and ask if there are any questions when we go to the end of the session.